My heart goes out to all the victims of the recent Texas floods, especially the children we lost. Families are suffering from unbearable pain, some comforted and clinging to their Christian faith as strongly as the survivors clung to tree branches to save their lives. This tragic event throws into sharp relief the point I want to make today. While we mourn with heavy hearts the victims of this recent Texas flood, I'm reminded of the worst flood in human history, the one we read about in Genesis, and I feel the same heaviness in my heart for those victims as well, despite how some may say they were universally cruel and wicked and deserved a violent, merciless death at God's hands. I bet the children and infants didn't. But I ask you, Christians, do you mourn for the victims of the Genesis flood, the genocidal conquests, and the firstborn slaughtered in the Egyptian Passover, the way you mourn for the lives lost in the Texas flood? I hope so. If you don't, I question your humanity, I question your empathy, and we'll examine how being an empath may lead to religious trauma. Hi everyone, I'm H.G.Roberts, deconverted Christian after 25 years and author of On Monsters and Phantoms, and here we talk about religious trauma and how the Bible itself ties us up in knots, leads to confusion, anxiety, fear, doubt, depression, emotional oblivion, mental paralysis, and ultimately trauma. I have a master's degree in mass communication, so I'm specifically interested in the messages the Bible communicates to us today, the cognitive filters we use to interpret those messages, and finally, the harmful impact those messages have on our self and world view. A major question I have that continues to haunt me and drive my curiosity to make these videos is, why do some people suffer from religious trauma and others don't? If you watched my interview with author and therapist Dr. Mark Karras, you know we entertained the question, what are the conditions present in a person's life that make religious trauma favorable to form, much like what are the atmospheric conditions necessary to form a destructive tornado? Why can Christian Jim over here shrug off teachings about hell, the rapture, slavery, misogyny, genocide, and original sin unaffected and unperturbed, while I and many other Christians fall into despair and anxiety, our souls tormented when wrestling with and embracing these doctrines? Why can Jim over here sincerely mourn the deaths of the children in the Texas flood while remaining unaffected by children who died in God's great worldwide flood, the genocides and Passover, or who will die in the tribulation? Whereas I agonize, shut down, and lose sleep over imagining and replaying the horrible fear and wailing the children undoubtedly experienced in all those events and will experience in the end times. I mean, the average Christian believes that all these biblical events were or are or will be as real as the recent Texas flood. So is it a God thing or a human thing that helps Jim not get swept up in anxiety and depression over all these biblical atrocities he believes are real? Is God helping Jim not sink into inescapable anxiety and depression through some merciful and divine work of the Holy Spirit inside Jim? Am I demon possessed because I can't seem to shake off the horrible feelings when I imagine all the biblical atrocities where millions of innocent children died heinous, ruthless deaths? Am I somehow deceived, deficient, unchosen, or unelected? What does Jim have that I don't have? And spoiler alert, it's not a God or spiritual thing, it's a human thing. It's called empathy, personal temperament, personality, and life events. I am a melancholic empath, and Jim isn't. And shame on God for not tuning the scriptures just right to account for empaths like me who lean more toward melancholic temperaments and have certain personality traits that we'll get into today. But I'll tell you why Jim and people like Jim also remain unaffected by all these biblical atrocities. It's because they're convinced that God was morally justified in carrying them out. They're on board with God's perfect judgment. All of those men, women, children, infants, and animals got what they deserved in their brutal deaths, so people like Jim don't have to empathize with them. Unlike some of us, they can put the issue to bed and not ruminate on it. You can watch this video here to see how sick and harmful that mindset is. So what's an empath? Well, being an empath means having an exceptional capacity to understand and share the feelings of others, often feeling those emotions intensely as if they were one's own. It's It's more than just empathy. It's a deep, sometimes overwhelming absorption of the emotions of those around you. Being an empath can be both a blessing and a curse. I'm not going to cover every trait of an empath here, but I will link you over to the WebMD's accessible explanation of empaths, how to know if you're an empath, and resources that provide more details about empaths, etc. But real quick, I want to share this from WebMD because it's relevant to our discussion today. In the broadest terms, there are two main forms of empathy. First, you've got emotional empathy, in which our feelings mirror those of someone else, and cognitive empathy, in which we intellectually understand another person's emotions. And according to the psychological literature, there are 4 different types of empaths. Emotional empath, this means you're very sensitive to other people's emotions. If someone you know is happy or angry, you may have those feelings as well. There's the intuitive empath. You're so skilled at picking up on the thoughts and emotions of others that your insights seem intuitive. Then there's the physical empath. You're sensitive to the physical pain others feel, sometimes to the point of feeling it yourself. And finally, there's the dark empath. You use your insights into the feelings of others to benefit yourself. As of today, we don't have a definitive large-scale study directly comparing religious trauma in empaths versus non-empaths. However, there is emerging research and clinical observation that supports the idea that highly sensitive or empathic individuals may be more vulnerable to religious trauma. Here's a breakdown of what we do know. Empaths often fall under the broader category of highly sensitive persons, or HSPs, a term popularized by Dr. Elaine Aron. I'll put a link to her website below, because it's a helpful resource. HSPs are known to process emotional and sensory stimuli more deeply, be more reactive to criticism, fear, or shame, and have a heightened sense of awareness of others' emotions and social dynamics. These traits can make HSPs more susceptible to internalizing religious messages, especially those involving guilt, punishment, sin, and hell. If it's ever been said about you that you are a way too sensitive overthinker, well, you're in good company. Okay, we know that religious trauma often stems from fear-based teachings, for example, hell and original sin, authoritarian control, for example, lack of questioning or rigid roles in a faith community, and chronic guilt or shame about being sinful or unworthy. Empaths may be especially prone to internalizing these teachings at a deep somatic, meaning felt within the body, and emotional level, not just intellectually. This can lead to CPTSD-like symptoms, spiritual OCD or scrupulosity, which we talk a lot about here, and deep existential anxiety. I hope you're starting to see the connections between HSPs, or highly sensitive persons, empaths, and religious trauma. While direct quantitative studies on empaths and religious trauma are limited, I want to summarize at a high level for you a few related research and clinician perspectives that kind of map this out for us. So you've got Dr. Marlene Winell, who coined the term religious trauma syndrome, and you've heard me talk a lot about her work, most notably her groundbreaking book, Leaving the Fold. Winell notes that those who are more sensitive or idealistic often struggle more with spiritual abuse and thus might deconstruct and deconvert from Christianity. Then there's Dr. Laura Anderson, a trauma therapist working with religious trauma. She emphasizes that people who were rule followers or had deep emotional connections to faith, like an HSP empath would, often have more complex trauma recovery processes. I hope to interview Dr. Anderson one day, have her here, on the channel. You can check out this helpful book she's written. Studies that explored attachment styles and religious trauma suggest that those prone to anxiety, often empaths, are more vulnerable to trauma in authoritarian religious contexts like fundamental evangelical Christianity. And finally, qualitative research such as interviews and case studies frequently highlight that those who describe themselves as sensitive, empathic, or deep feelers often experience longer-lasting and more intense effects from religious trauma. Now let's talk specifically about mental temperaments. So if you've watched a lot of my videos, and I even said it in this one, I have a melancholic temperament. Well, what does that mean? I'll link to the 4 Temperaments website below so you can explore further. But if you're suffering from religious trauma, I highly encourage you to begin to understand not just if you're an HSP empath, and there's a good chance you are, but also your temperament, whether you're choleric, melancholy, sanguine, or phlegmatic, or a combination of those. There's an assessment you can take at that website. Understanding who you are and how you'll react or behave in response to biblical stories of atrocities, plus the hell and original sin doctrines and stuff like that, is critically important to gaining control over your religious trauma and healing from it. I highly recommend exploring all this with a qualified secular therapist. The more you know about yourself, the more likely it is you can recover from the tailspin that is religious trauma. As I said, I have a melancholic temperament. A person with a melancholic temperament is typically thoughtful and introspective, detail-oriented and analytical, emotionally sensitive and empathetic, prone to perfectionism and idealism, cautious, reserved, and often serious. People with melancholic temperaments may also be more susceptible to worry, sadness, or self-criticism, especially in stressful or emotionally charged environments. While they can appear moody or pessimistic, they are often deeply caring, loyal, and committed to causes or relationships they believe in. And by the way, people with phlegmatic temperaments are also prone to suffer from religious trauma. Now, couple this with what we already know about HSP empaths, and it becomes even more clear why some of us would react to Scripture so negatively through absorbing the horrors presented in so much of the war, judgment, wrath, and death-laced biblical narrative. If you're an HSP empath, there's a good chance you have, at least in part, a melancholic temperament, and there's evidence to suggest that a melancholic HSP empath is more prone to suffer from religious trauma. The Bible, the self-proclaimed perfect holy book, gives us stories and a God who acts and behaves in such premeditatively barbaric, wrathful, and savage ways that melancholic HSP empaths who accept it as true and literal will most likely be the ones who suffer from religious trauma. But there's another layer to all of this. In addition to knowing your temperament, it's also very important to know your personality type to be effective in your fight to overcome religious trauma. Two wonderful assessment tools to explore are the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, and Enneagram personality tests. I've touched on these in my series on religious trauma, but they're worth mentioning here again. Take what we know about HSP empaths and melancholic temperaments, and now couple that with what these personality tests reveal, and the reasons why we suffer from religious trauma come into even sharper focus. I'll let you explore these two tests on your own, but some quick things to be aware of. If you're an HSP empath with a melancholic temperament, you're likely going to rate higher on the feeling and intuition preferences in the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator assessment, and that's no surprise. You'll see what I mean when you complete the assessment. People with higher feeling and intuition indicators tend to be idealistic and values-driven, prioritize harmony and emotional resonance, absorb others' emotions easily, sound familiar? That's our empath, and struggle with rigid systems that feel morally unjust, which maps well to religious trauma triggers. Related to the Enneagram assessment, I am an Enneagram type 4, which is the individualist, deep feelers who absorb beauty, pain, and complexity. There are a few other Enneagram types that map to HSP melancholic empaths, such as Type 2, the helper, who is empathy-driven by a need to serve and be loved. Or Type 6, the loyalist, who is often deeply connected to authority, community, and fear of abandonment, which can heighten vulnerability to religious control and fear. And finally, Type 9, the peacemaker, who is tuned into others' needs to avoid conflict and keep harmony. It's interesting to note that Type 4s like me and Type 6s in particular tend to suffer deeply from existential anxiety, making them more prone to religious scrupulosity, these obsessive moral compulsions we've talked about in other videos, or fear of divine rejection. I love the rich insights and level of detail you get from the Enneagram assessment. It's very thorough and comprehensive, so check it out if you haven't already. Though this all is not yet a perfect science, we're getting there, I hope I'm connecting some dots for you and helping you understand how all of this relates. Y'all, if you haven't explored the Myers-Briggs type indicator or Enneagram assessments, and you're curious to how all this relates to your religious trauma, well, get to work. You'll be amazed at what you learn. And once you learn it, you'll get a clearer picture of how and why you're more prone to suffering from religious trauma and so negatively impacted by Christianity. I have to repeat again here. Not every Christian melancholic HSP empath who's an Enneagram Type 4 individualist and an MBTI intuitive feeler will suffer from religious trauma. Well, why not? Well, we've got at least one other intervening or mediating factor to consider, and I mention it in just about every video I make: exposure to one or more adverse childhood experiences. For me, it was sexual and physical abuse and parental divorce. You mix that together with everything else we've been talking about here, and the conditions are favorable, really more like probable, to spawn a religious trauma tornado. In my last video, I avail you to some scholarly literature that drives this point home. Okay, let's take a quick time out and gather ourselves here. I've thrown a lot at you. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all this new information and you're struggling to make sense of it, don't worry. I'm more of a visual learner, so here's a simple graphic I created to help you absorb all of this. We start by knowing if you're a highly sensitive person, or HSP. If so, you're very likely an empath, which means it's likely that you either have a melancholic or phlegmatic temperament and would rate higher on the feeling and intuitive preferences in the Myers-Briggs type indicator assessment. And you're likely to be an Enneagram 2, 4, 6, or 9. Now, add in having one or more adverse childhood experiences and being indoctrinated into Christianity, and I'd bet good money that you've either suffered from religious trauma or you're currently suffering from it. Notice nowhere in this graph do we account for demon possession or being unelected. Those things are phantoms. They don't exist. You guys, this is a model of how someone might arrive at religious trauma. It's not the only model. And at this point, until more studies are done, it's what I would call a competent hypothesis. My channel exists to help coax the truth of all this out of hiding. So please share your perspectives if you're an expert in this area. Let's work together. So what does this sound like from Christians who want to accuse you of following a false theology or being deceived because you deconverted after suffering from religious trauma? Well, here's a comment I received from my last video on the parable of the talents. I think that the parable portrays God as a demanding master, but I would not go so far as to say that it represents God as an evil and savage tyrant. That's where I think you're reading your own experience back into the text, which is not what Christ meant when he originally spoke the parable. You guys, this illustrates my point. We take who we are, our cognitive filters, and how we are shaped with us as we walk out our Christian faith and interpretively respond to what Scripture says. That this commenter doesn't see God as an evil and savage tyrant says something about who he is and what has shaped him and the cognitive filters he's developed to process information. Not surprisingly, in a separate thread, he told me he didn't have the kind of childhood I had. So, when you're deeply negatively emotionally affected by all the biblical atrocities shoved down our throats, plus exposed to the actions and character of a God who created, caused, or allowed them, yes, you're primed for religious trauma, especially if you've also suffered from adverse childhood experiences. It's not that you're demon-possessed, deceived, following a false religion, or that you're unelected or unchosen. We're all built uniquely and differently, though the science and the assessments I mentioned can shed a ton of light on who we are and why we respond the way we do to things. And this is what apologists and pastors fail to account for. This is what the deficient man-made God of the Iron and Bronze Ages fails to account for. This man-made God Christians believe in absolutely sucks at understanding what a melancholic, individualist, thinking and feeling HSP empath is and why his gloating about committing, causing, or allowing all these biblical atrocities would lead us away from him and want nothing to do with him. Finally, think about everything we've said here. If God created us all uniquely, if we are fearfully and wonderfully made in his image, albeit sinful and wicked in the womb, then he created some of us to respond negatively to his own word. Thus, we'd suffer from religious trauma. God made you to suffer. That's not love. It's sick. And you can let all of that go. So thanks for being here, everyone. Let me know your thoughts on this one, especially if you've suffered from religious trauma or you're suffering from it currently. I always love hearing from you guys. If you want to support this channel, please like, subscribe, share, comment, do all the things. But a way to do that financially, since I don't have Patreons or sponsors, is by purchasing On Monsters and Phantoms. It's my memoir about severe religious trauma and deconversion from Christianity, of course, and giving it a positive review. The link to it on Amazon is below. I appreciate that. If you do buy it, let me know so I can publicly thank you in my next video if you're comfortable with that. I try to put out a new video each week where we take a deep dive into what religious trauma is, how it forms, and whom it's most likely to form, and what we can do about it if it does form. If you'd like me to cover a specific topic, let me know in the comments. And if you're new here and curious about religious trauma or think you may be suffering from it, well, explore the channel, have a look around to see what other topics I've covered. And until next time, let's continue to catalyze a conversation together about religious trauma, to let those who suffer from it know that there's hope, and to let those who dismiss it know that it's real.